welcome everybody. My name is Eric Kaplan. I have the pleasure of being one of the colleagues of Jeffrey Schein, who has organized today's activity in the Kaplan Center. Um, I'll just say a couple of words quickly about the Kaplan Center for those of you who are not aware of us. We were organized at the end of 2010 at the initiative primarily of our friend and colleague Dan Cederbaum in Evanston, Illinois. And we're a not-for-profit organization. And our goal is really to try to facilitate the transformation of Jewish community. We decided to go for a small goal through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century. And our work is very much trans-denominational, and that's especially noticeable if you'll go to our website and take a look at our conferences and see who are the breadth of people who have appeared at our conferences. It's our policy to record all of our seminars as we do them. That way, people who have attended and who want to review it are able to do that, but also people who are not able to make it for a variety of reasons are able to do it, are able to watch it. If you're uncomfortable with being recorded, you really have two choices, I guess. One is to turn your video off, and the other would be, of course, to leave the session. If you stay in the session, then we are working on the assumption that you are all right with the recording that we're going to be doing. And after today's session, today's recording will also be available on our website, not immediately, but pretty soon thereafter. Just to keep things civilized, we're going to have people unmuted at when our main speakers are presenting. Presenters can unmute themselves. We, of course, very much want to have a dialogue here as well. So we invite you to participate either through posting into the chat, or you can send questions or comments to me directly at Eric, E-R-I-C, at KaplanCenter, one word, .org. Again, Eric at KaplanCenter.org. But it's probably simplest if you can put your thoughts into the chat. When our formal presentation is finished in about an hour and 20 or so minutes from now, it's become kind of our tradition to hang around for for a little bit of extra time and to speak informally amongst ourselves, and we invite you to do so. Today's event, in addition to the Kaplan Center, we've got co-sponsors, which are the Reconstructionist Educators of North America, RENA, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, and Reconstructing Judaism. And we're very, very happy to see so many of you online today, including rabbis, educators, and lay leaders. I recognize many of you from previous sessions. As you know, we've had quite a rich year in the world of Jewish education through the Kaplan Center, all pretty much spearheaded by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Jeffrey Schein. Just to go at a quick greatest hits, on August 23rd, we had the launch of the 21st Kaplanian Vision for Jewish Education pages on the website. About a half a year later, we gathered to learn and to celebrate Sandy Sasso's book, Judy Led the Way. And we've had in the last couple of months 3 colloquia on different aspects of 21st century Kaplanian vision. And this kind of brings us to today's event, which is kind of focused on the new volume, Lifelong Spirituality and God Connection, a suite of Kaplanian learning resources. And in addition to hearing from Dr. Shine about this, and Tova Switzer, who will get us started with some words of Torah, Jeffrey has invited 4 scouts to say what they found in the volume and to present some of their own impressions. So now we get to the last thing that I have to do, which is, of course, to introduce Rabbi Spitzer. So she is a popular teacher of courses on Judaism and economic justice, Reconstructionist Judaism, new approaches to thinking about God, and the practice of integrating Jewish spiritual and ethical teachings into daily life. She's a spiritual leader of the Reconstructionist congregation, Dorshei Tzedek in Newton, Massachusetts. She served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association from 2007 to 2009, and she's also a past president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. Her forthcoming book is called God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, which makes her a fitting person to get us going. And as an aside, I'll say that on the Evolve website, she has a wonderful piece on Jews and reparations, which I very, very strongly recommend. And for those of you who want to troll past issues of Reconstructionism today, she has a number of very, very wonderful articles there as well. So it's really a pleasure to introduce you, Tova, and in so doing, mute myself.
Eric, thank you. Really lovely, lovely introduction. I put in the chat a link to the book. You can actually pre-order it. It's not coming out till March 2022. I completely hate the blurb they wrote, but ignore the blurb and go ahead and order it. So my goal in 20 minutes is I would like to share with you what the book is about and what I'm trying to do. And I think it has direct implications for education. I'm both honored and humbled that Mel Skult is here. So I'll be really interested, Mel, in your thoughts on how I see this as an extension, my work as an extension of Kaplan's thought. So I wanted to begin at the very beginning with Rabbi Mordecai M. Kaplan. So I'm going to pull up some words of his to start us off. And this is really sort of this little paragraph from Kaplan I think is sort of the beginning of my journey into and you'll see where I ended up. So in around 1948, The Future of the American Jew, Mordecai M. Kaplan wrote this: "We must learn to distinguish between the belief in God and the conception of God. The belief in God is the intuitive experience of cosmic power upon which we depend for our existence and self-fulfillment. It is therefore the basic substance of religion and is a constant factor in it. On the other hand, the particular conception of God is a cultural formulation of that belief. It varies with the particular stage of humanity's intellectual and social development." So what was important to me in that statement is this really helpful distinction between what Kaplan calls belief, but really he's talking about an experience, not a intellectual belief, but an experience of the divine, which he says is intuitive, exists across time and space in all cultures, but the concepts, the ways we put that experience into language is cultural. It depends on who we are, where we are. And he also, and I'll get back to this, he also saw it as evolving. He saw it as sort of getting progressively more complex or abstract or developed over the course of human history. So I think it's a really helpful distinction. I also really appreciate that Kaplan begins with human experience. And that was in general his approach to metaphysics, which he said he didn't have a lot of use for, but I think actually did a lot of. But that all we can really talk about is our experience. And I wanted to share another quote with you, another piece with you from a non-Jewish, I don't think she's Jewish, anthropologist who, as you'll see when I bring this quote, is clearly a Reconstructionist, even though she doesn't know it. So let me share this next quote that brings sort of a scientific perspective to what Kaplan said. So this is a wonderful book. If you've never read it, it's called Evolving God, A Provocative View on the Origins of Religion. Barbara J. King is an anthropologist. She works with apes and prehistoric human culture. This is what King writes in this book. We humans crave emotional connections with others. This deep desire to connect can be explained by the long evolutionary history we share with other primates. At the same time, it explains why humans evolved to become the spiritual ape, the ape that grew a large brain, the ape that stood up, the ape that first created art, but above all, the ape that evolved God. And this is my bold. I believe that the desire for emotional connection with the sacred is fundamental to our species. And she elsewhere calls this a category of belongingness, which again, you'll hear the Kaplanian echoes. The religious imagination thrives on the human yearning to enter into emotional experience with some force vaster than ourselves. The human religious imagination developed in ever-widening circles of engagement from immediate social companions to members of a larger group, then across groups, and eventually to a wholly other dimension, the realm of sacred beings. So again, you can see sort of how I see King's work picking up on Kaplan in a way, even though she was writing much more recently. That's from 2007. But this notion, again, that there's something deeply human about, that she's not saying God doesn't exist or that there isn't a realm of divinity, but she's saying the way we humans access it is through this sense of belongingness that expands beyond, even the human realm and goes into this other realm. And that takes very different forms in different cultures. But we have evidence of it going back tens, even hundreds of thousands of years. So I summarize all this by saying when we're talking about God, we're talking about human experience of the divine. And that's really all that we can access. And now I want to go to where Kaplan continues in his discussion of this. And this is both interesting and also where I part ways with him, or maybe go in a different direction. And maybe he would have too if he had stuck around. I don't know if he was alive today. I don't know. So this is what Kaplan says. This continues from that earlier piece that I brought. The chief problem confronting the historic religions nowadays is not how to lead people to believe in the cosmic power that sustains human life. It is rather how we shall conceive of God. Does the awareness of God depend upon our conceiving God as a personal being, or may God be conceived other ways, and yet be the subject of our awareness or the object of our worship? Nothing would be lost if we substituted for the notion of like a personal being, a supernatural God, the one of process, which at least with the aid of science, most of us find quite understandable. Why then not conceive God as process rather than as some kind of identifiable entity? So this was, again, I think a really helpful insight that, people are having the experiences they're having, right? If you ask people if they've had spiritual experiences, most will raise their hand. If you say, do you believe in God? Like 10% will, depending on who you're asking. But he's saying, so there's something problem with our conceptual problem. So I think, Jane, what he's saying is the problem is with the concepts, that the experience is there, but our concepts aren't keeping up with the experience. And what people are rejecting is a concept. And so we need to change the concept. And he proposes process as one concept. And in his book, Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, he talks about talking about God as a power or as a process. And he thinks that will be much more accessible to modern contemporary American Jews. And I was totally with Kaplan for a long time. I got very interested in process theology, which is almost impossible to understand, but is really interesting. And I tried to write about it in ways that make it more accessible. I did some writing in the CCR journal and the Reconstructionist journal. And I love this idea of God as process. It's a wonderful way to think about it. And that's where I was. I was like, God is process. If we talk about God as process, people can access it. Zeu Gamarnu, our work is done. Then one day I was at a bookstore, and there was that table where like the staff of the bookstore put their favorite books. And one of the books I was drawn to has like the weirdest, longest title, but for some reason I was very drawn to it. It's a book by James Geary, and it's called I is an Other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes the Way We See the World. I was already interested in metaphor. I'd done some reading of George Lakoff. But in this book, I is an Other, Geary summarizes in a very accessible way the field of cognitive linguistics. And cognitive linguistics is based on the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, beginning with their book in 1980, Metaphors We Live By. And what Geary was able to do was also incorporate much more recent research in neuroscience, which buttresses their linguistic approach, which basically makes the argument that it is impossible for human beings to function in the world, to understand our lives and to talk about it, and even not just talk about it, understand it and act on it without metaphor. Our brains function through metaphor. This is their contention. I'm not saying everybody agrees with it, but this is a whole field of linguistics that makes this argument. And their argument is that we can't talk about our emotional lives. We can't talk about or even experience anger or sadness, for example. We can't describe arguing. We can't describe the life of the mind. We can't even talk about life itself or love without metaphor. And this happens completely unconsciously. All right, or almost completely unconsciously. I'm going to share again to show you what it looks like. So this is how metaphor works. I'm giving you a literally 1 minute on 1 foot intro here. The way it works is this. There's a target domain. The target domain is what we're trying to access, and it's conceptual, it's large, it's a part of our experience, it's an embodied experience, but it's large and complex. Anger, ideas, time, right? These are things that humans, part of our experience. To access those things, to talk about them in any way, we need metaphors. Metaphors are always based in our physical experience, and those are called source domains. The source domain is a realm of our physical experience that, in our cultural context, we then use as a metaphor to get at these other things. So, for example, this is going to sound weird, but you'll see where I'm going. A very common metaphor for anger in many cultures is anger is a hot liquid in a container. Another common metaphor in English is anger is a horse. And you say, that's ridiculous. Anger's not a horse. But then you look at our language and you see this. They are boiling mad. She blew her top. I need to blow off some steam. We use metaphors of anger is a hot liquid in a container all the time. And we also use anger as a horse a lot. Unbridled anger. He couldn't rein in his temper. Here are some ways you can harness your anger. So this is how linguists find these metaphors. They look at common phrases in our speech. Again, in our culture, ideas are food, ideas are people, ideas are plants, ideas are cutting instruments, ideas are commodities. Here are some examples. Ideas are food. She devoured the book. Let that idea gel. Ideas are people. He's the father of modern biology. Those ideas died off long ago. Cognitive psychology is in its infancy. Ideas are commodities. It's important how you package your ideas. That's a worthless idea. She's a source of valuable ideas. So again, we operate in these metaphors all the time, usually unconsciously. And what's important, I'm going to use the one about time is really important. So a very dominant metaphor in our culture, not in all cultures, but in our culture, is that time is money or time is a limited resource. And we use this in our language all the time. You're wasting my time. This gadget will save you hours. How do you spend your time these days? We need to budget our time. What I want to emphasize, and I think the time example shows it the best, is that these metaphors actually structure how we experience time. Time is a concept in physics. Time is not actually a limited resource. However, the way we've organized our lives, it now is. And so when we're in a doctor's office waiting room for 2 hours, waiting to get in, we experience ourselves as wasting time. This is a fairly new metaphor. It's only since the Industrial Revolution. It's only since certain societies started paying people based on their time. Before that, and in cultures where this is not a dominant metaphor, people do not experience time that way. People waiting at the side of a road for a bus are not wasting time. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but they're not wasting time. They are experiencing time totally differently. And we don't always, even those of us in this culture don't always experience time as a limited resource. Sometimes we experience it as an endless flow in different directions. So the main point I want you to take from this is that we need metaphors to describe complex experiences, and we need multiple metaphors for complex experiences. We need more than one, and that the metaphor itself will shape our experience of that thing. So the other thing that Lakoff and Johnson write about is that metaphors are not true and false. It's not true or false that time is a limited resource. It's just, what's true about it is that it has the power to shape our experience and to shape our thought and to shape our action. That's the power of metaphor. It's not something we debate whether it's true or not. It's just, how does this metaphor shape my experience? And this brings me back to God. So I was reading Geary's book, and he explained three different kinds of metaphors on the analogy of a volcano. And this is where I sort of got to why I think this is important for our thinking about God. One metaphor is that there's an active volcano. An active metaphor is a metaphor that we read it. We know we're reading a metaphor. It's obvious. It's poetic. Mary Oliver writes the dark hug of time. We understand that time doesn't hug anybody. So we're like, oh, that's a beautiful poetic metaphor. There's a dormant volcano, a dormant metaphor. Those are metaphors. We know they're metaphors, but they're very common in our speech. I'm up a creek without a paddle. We know what that means. I know that I'm not actually in a creek. Then there's what Geary calls an extinct metaphor, which Lakoff and Johnson call metaphors we live by. These are metaphors that we function in all the time. We have no idea they're metaphors. The most basic example is when we say, I see what you mean. This is a metaphor called seeing is knowing, and it's based in our infancy, when if you can't see something, it's not there. See what you mean is not a literal statement, but it's a metaphor that we function in. Another very basic metaphor, she's a very warm person. This is a basic connection between emotional closeness and physical warmth, probably from being held as a child and feeling physical warmth and connecting that to emotional connection. And the neurons in our brain actually connect. So the part of our brain that registers emotional closeness connects via neurons to the part of our brain that registers physical warmth, and hence the metaphor becomes part of our experience. What I realized when I read this in the Geary is that when most of us talk about God, most of the time in the West, we are functioning in a metaphor, and that metaphor is God is a big person. And even if we don't believe that, and even if we know God is not a big person, it doesn't matter. We're in that metaphor, and when we say we don't believe in God, or when we say we do believe in God, or when we say we're having trouble with God, we're not having trouble with God, and we're not believing or disbelieving in God. We're wrestling with that metaphor. And I think this is what Kaplan understood, but he did not have the language of cognitive linguistics to sort of point to it. The problem is this extinct metaphor is so deep in our consciousness that it becomes a huge barrier, and it certainly becomes a barrier in Jewish education. Where I depart from Kaplan and I depart from Ramban, and even though it was very kind of Jeffrey to connect me to Ramban in his in your commentary on my piece in the book, I actually don't totally agree with them, because the issue is not about being limited. There was two things. One is not that we're limited by human language in our attempts to access the divine. It's rather that we have to take extremely seriously our language in accessing the divine. It's not a limit. It's actually the only pathway we have in. It's in our bodies. And if we don't take it extremely seriously, we'll continue to miss chances to connect to the divine. More than that, no one metaphor will ever help us access the divine. It's not that God is not a big person. It's that maybe sometimes that metaphor is helpful. Other times it's extremely damaging. So we need many metaphors to access the divine, because metaphor is not just about language, about our brains. It's also about our bodies. It's about our whole experience. I also part way with Maimonides and Kaplan, because they both had this assumption that when it comes to our theology and our connection to God, we're getting ever more sophisticated, and that our ancestors and the Torah is somehow primitive. I would say it's exactly the opposite, that the biblical authors had exquisite and multi-dimensional ways of connecting to the divine that we have mostly lost. I really believe we've lost it. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to read it, but there's a beautiful insight in James Kugel's The God of Old, which is a great book that I would recommend. He talks about, for the biblical authors, it's the realm of the spiritual and this world were very close. There was a very thin line dividing them, and people would access divinity very easily. And a malach Adonai, a messenger of God, could turn up at any point and be almost anything. It could be a fire in a bush. It could be a person. It could be a donkey. But they had access to the sacred, I think, in ways that we no longer have. So once I realized that I should be looking at metaphor, and once I realized that there was a lot of wisdom to be had in our ancient texts that maybe we weren't taking seriously enough, I sort of dived into Tanakh and started asking the question, what non-human metaphors are there in our tradition? And much to my surprise, I realized there's a lot. Our ancestors who wrote the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh I use the analogy of a palette. I feel like they had this palette of hundreds of colors of ways of experiencing the divine, and we've lost most of those colors. We're sort of left with, I don't know, like what choose a boring color, like one. And there was water, there's fire, there's rock, and more. And again, it's not that you're not familiar with this. If you could think probably of verses that call God Makor Mayim Chaim, the fount of living waters, Sur Yisrael, Kuma Bezrat Yisrael, the rock of Israel. But I think we think of those as literary. We don't understand that they were actually metaphors and they were ways of accessing the divine. So my book and the work I've been doing for the last now almost 10 years is to really try to re-enliven these metaphors and have access to them. And it's really important, as I was doing this work, to realize that it's not that the God is a big person is the dominant metaphors and the rest of these are like sort of sidebars or not really that serious. It's really that I think they were all, you'll see many metaphors in one scene even in the Torah. I think through metaphor, the authors of the Tanakh were trying to get at something that they knew was beyond ultimately any one way of expressing it. And one example of what happens when we shift metaphors. So about 5 years ago, my spouse Gina died of cancer. And I remember being in that situation and being very drawn to a chant that Rabbi Sheffa Gold had put to a verse from Isaiah. When I pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. And I was thinking about what a lot of people say when they're going through something terrible, like Gina and I were going through that year, which is, why is God doing this to me? That question, again, is inside the metaphor of God as a big person. God's a big person doing something nasty to me. When I was chanting this chant by Sheffa and thinking about God as water, I was working a lot on God as water. I was like, well, if God's the water, and it says, God is with me, I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. All of a sudden, the question wasn't, why is God doing this to me? The question was, how do I navigate this? What is going to sustain me? And also the waters are very turbulent right now. How do I navigate this? How do I navigate this is a completely different theological question than why is God doing this to me? And it was enormously helpful to me as I was navigating that. And again, the same can be said for exploring God as fire or God as rock or God as makom, as place, a beautiful rabbinic metaphor. And I just want to end by saying that as an educator, working with the God as metaphor stuff has been truly transformative. I've done most of my work with adults. For some people, it's been a way for them to get access to Jewish text and tradition because the other metaphor for God was such an obstacle. But even for folks who are comfortable with the God as a big person, sometimes having this palette of metaphors has been enormously helpful. I've started doing work with kids. I've done some stuff with 5th and 6th graders. What I've realized is doing this as sort of a separate unit doesn't work. And I think what we need to do, and this is where I want to leave us, is to take these metaphors seriously as pathways to the divine, and from the very earliest time, start using those metaphors with other names of God. And I'm going to end with screen sharing something that I have shared with kids and parents. The many names of God, these are all from Jewish tradition. There are Hebrew cognates to all of these. And this is the palette we have, and I try to make it very colorful. This is the palette we have, but we don't use it at all. We don't use it enough. And Sandy Sasso's In God's Name is a beautiful example of trying to use this palette, although she mostly uses human metaphors. These are some human and many non-human. I'll just read them, and as I say them, just see what the word evokes for you. Voice, which is kol, compassionate one, breath, place, spirit, ehyeh, becoming, echad, one, rock, fountain of life, father, creating, river of delight, loving, cloud, fire, shelter, power, ruler, source of living waters, friend, mother, beauty, teacher, peace, strength, song, life of the cosmos, the way, infinity. So I guess my hope and my plea is that, again, to me, this is very much extending Kaplan's work, is that we start picking up that palette of colors again and using it, and I think it will be enormously helpful. Again, the book attempts to do this. Each chapter takes a different metaphor, goes deeply into it, and then offers practices for each metaphor. And I do hope afterwards to write a young people's version of it so that it's accessible to younger folks. So I'm done. I don't think we have time for questions unless Jeffrey decides we do. But anyway, that's I put a link in the chat. I'll put it in again if you want to pre-order the book. Again, I really don't like the blurb they wrote. Although there's a nice little blurb from Art Green on it. You can go to that link and pre-order it, but it's not coming out till next March. So thank you for this opportunity to share with you. Sorry that was a lot very fast, but I did the best I could in the time I had. So.
Okay, that was
you did great, Toba. Thank you so much. And if you're able to stay with us, there will be time for some questions near the end. I hope you can.
Great.
And so very rich, your reference to the palette of colors reminds me that Rabbi Sandy Sasso's God's Paintbrush is highlighted in our volume with lots of links, including a study guide that Rabbi Joe Blair and I did a good number of years ago. So we're going to be moving on now with a great foundation, with great inspiration Rabbi Spitzer provided for us. And I want to talk to you a little bit about book celebrations. This is a book celebration and exploration. And what I'd like to do first is to ask you, either by raising your hand or going to the reaction icon on your screen, to say if you've ever been to a book celebration. And if you have, thumbs up or hands.
I didn't hear this question, Jeff.
So the question was, have you ever been to a book celebration? Okay, all right, very good. Well, I hope you'll find this book celebration a bit different. And to underscore the differences, I'm going to invite you to do 3 quickly linked imaginings with me. First will be easiest. I'd like you, and for those of you who are in the study where you work, this will be particularly easy. I'd like you for a minute to look around and see and just note all the good books that you've been meaning to read or that you think might be useful for your work, but you never quite make that reach to get them off the shelf, or you never go to the folder in which you've stored them in your computer. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to say, is that resources require energy to explore, and this is an exploration designed to help get you started to see if there's something very valuable here that our scouts, our explorers will take us to. Second image, come with me now. Almost 40 years ago, and be with me as I am the education director at a synagogue in suburban Philadelphia. It's my second day on the job, and I want to tour the facility. So I walk into the library, and I see this sign above the library. I think it came from the American Jewish Librarians Association. And the sign says, "Of the making of books, there is no end. Asot Sefarim Harbe Ein Kates," from the book of Kohelet. Well, it's all in the Dagesh, right? Where you put the emphasis. These librarians were trying to tell us, I'll give you a rendition, of the making of books, there is no end. But Kohelet probably meant something more like, of the making of books, there is no end. It's saturated in the skepticism of Kohelet. So I want you now to come with me. It's one of my enduring lessons about the importance of context when you quote a text. And I want you to come with me now about 100 years ago, and you'll find the same quote, "Asot Sefarim Harbe Ein Kates," making of many books, there is no end. And you're with me now at the opening of the Frankfurt Jewish Lehrhaus, and you're listening to Franz Rosenzweig's address, and he turns to that same verse from Kohelet, and he underscores some doubts and ways that we should be thinking differently about this. He says that the real value of books can only be when they come out of our living and the dialogue and the relationship to Jewish living. And unfortunately, over the last 50 years, Rosenzweig looking back, there's been a tendency in Jewish life to treat the creation of books as if, here's my prop here, this is a necklace, as if the purpose is to give us jewels to adorn a necklace with a beautiful saying. He's speaking now about the Maskilim and the scholars of the Wissenschaft school, and to give us a beautiful statement about Judaism that proves to ourselves and to those around us, the non-Jewish audiences, how beautiful and important Judaism is. Well, again, he comes back to that's not the way or the purpose or the meaning of books. The real meaning, deepest meaning of books is when they come out of dialogue and Jewish living. That will explain to you why, in thinking about this book celebration, I thought it was so very important to turn to the people who live Jewish learning, several of our educators and rabbis, and ask them out of their experience to immerse themselves in the book and find things that have living existential Jewish value to them as they share them with you. And we will turn to those people in just a few minutes. I am going to ask the help now of Rabbi Erin Hirsch, who has served the Kaplan Center well for the last several years, and I'll say a bit about her near the end of our presentation. And Erin's going to take us to the volume as you would find it in the link you got for today's program and on the Kaplan Center website. So as Erin brings this up, I'm going to tell you that our next move here, before turning to our scouts, our explorers, is to recognize the wisdom that comes from Stephen Brookfield, a wonderful scholar of adult learning, who says that we always ought to be playing the assumption hunting game. We always ought to be looking at the assumptions that underlie a piece of literature or book. So I want to come clean here. I want to share with you both the Jewish assumptions that guide lifelong spirituality and God connection, and then with the help of my wife, Dr. Deborah Schein, some of the educational assumptions, and hopefully that will help you navigate the things that our scouts have found in a better way. So Erin, if you could go to the very next page. I worked very hard here to make this simple. Just going to read it to you. Here's what we're about Jewishly. Jewish tradition revels in the magic of the number 3. This volume is fashioned out of 3 Jewish values. Ruchaniot, spirituality that is deeply implanted within us. Sefer HaChaim, learning that is lifelong. And Elohut, the Kaplanian conviction that God and godliness are experienced within and around us as well as beyond us, and wish people that they deepen their connection to Ruchaniot, Sefer Chaim, and Elohut as they go through the volume. So that's what's underlying this Jewishly. And now I want to talk a little bit to how the volume is organized and a learning. Deb just told me earlier, it's a metaphor, Jeffrey. What we're sharing is a metaphor, and indeed it is. So I'm going to move so Deb could come into the picture, but share with you that Deb has been an early childhood educator since 1972, receiving her PhD in early childhood education with a focus on spiritual development in 2012. She is the founder of Growing Wonder, which supports ongoing research, dialogue, and activities around spiritual development, nature, play, peace, and well-being. And Erin, if you could take us down, Deb and I will share the poem. Might take a moment. Erin, are you able to bring up lifelong learning? You're doing that right now. See, it's so hard on Zoom to read signals. I should have known that. I know Aaron is so dependable, but just couldn't see it.
Is it just down?
It's, no, it's down a little more. Okay, Aaron's going to run through this, and these are links and resources for you. We're going to read, actually, this will be fine, Aaron. We're reading from a Talmud page where people like Rabbi Sandy Sasko, Rabbi James Green, Rabbi Aaron Hirsch were invited to comment on the poem. But first, let's hear the poem.
Okay, the poem is, some of you may have heard it already, but it is a Talmud page. Love starts the learning.
Experience makes it grow.
Language gives it meaning.
For people to share and know.
Values give us lenses.
Relationships make us whole.
All guiding us to live our lives.
Integrating learning with our souls.
So this poem was written, it actually came through me. I mean, it just was there almost in totality. After I did a workshop on what's Jewish about butterflies down in Florida, carried my suitcase of rocks. And the purpose of these workshops were to help early childhood educators in sort of incorporate, understand, and internalize the Jewish values that they were supposed to be teaching.
Aaron, at this point, I think you can take down the share screen and let people see Deb. Okay.
So the poem came to me, and now so many years later, Jeff and I both, see such deep value in the poem itself. For myself, the whole idea of learning, especially learning of young children from birth to age 5 or 6, 7, 8, it's like gotten out of control. People are only looking at a small box of what should be taught to children. And the way I see learning for young children is from a spiritual lens, where there's more to learning. There's more even to value teaching. There's a spiritual sense that needs to be nurtured from the beginning of life that it's not talked about. It's like we know it's there, but it isn't being nurtured consistently. I just got off another Zoom call that was about play and, really deep play, letting children play. So this poem is big when you peel the metaphor.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'd also like you to raise your hand now if you feel like, since you're well beyond the earliest stages of life, you've outgrown your need for love. Well, obviously, that was a no-brainer. Or play. But it is to point out that what I'm going to share with you shouldn't be construed as a hierarchy, but instead of actually organizing metaphors to integrate the contributions to the volume. So I want to say that the volume is built around the poem. The resources aggregate around the key lines from the poem. Love starts the learning from birth. Experience makes it grow. We have a lot of things called from different presenters around the nature of expanding experience. Language gives it meaning for people to share and know. Some of the resources are how you expand people's inventory of language and metaphor. Values give us lenses, relationships make us whole. I want to say that in the volume, I'm just calling this one out to give you the feel of the volume, that in the volume, the mediating between these lines, language gives it meaning for people to share and know, and values gives us lenses. An example that I think you would find interesting that's very targeted to this is faith in the Holocaust, Jewish teenagers and faith in the Holocaust. And it's emblematic of jumping on this potential, this extraordinary potential and wonderful minds that our tweens and teens have to be able to incorporate concepts and apply them and stretch themselves with new Jewish ideas. And I want to indicate at the very end, which you can see in the commentaries that attach the book, all guiding us to live our lives, integrating learning with our souls. I think one of the places where this comes to be so important is in our relationship to prayer and spirituality. So one of the pleasures of doing this volume is to come make new contributions and collect new contributions, but also to reprise the old. So I'm very glad that Reconstructing Judaism gave us permission to go back to a volume, several of you are contributors, called Connecting Prayer and Spirituality, which was developed as Kol HaNeshama came out. And I want to tell you in relationship, Rabbi Elise Kramer, who's one of the commentators, talks about this, to this challenge, there are a set of 6 essays with study questions by people like Rabbi Jacob Staub, Sid Schwartz, David Teutsch, and others that help us explore these issues as people look to turn to that stage of their growth where they're really looking for patterns of Jewish living. And it's pre-made. I don't believe that everything should be easy for educators or rabbis, but I wanted people to have access to something that could be a 6-part mini course with really great thinking and guide questions that Leah Mundell, who was working this at the time, developed for each essay. It's there. And again, as you scan through the volume, you will see the resources are connected back to the learning poem that we can think of as the learning spine of the book, and if that helps the learning be coherent in the relationship, and add that to the threefold spirituality, lifelong learning, and experimenting in our God concepts, I think gives you the things that I'm proudest about with the volume. So I want to, at this point, come back to you, and also come back to the Scouts I promised. We're only 1 week out, not even 1 week from Shalach Lecha, from the portion where Scouts were sent out to report back about the land. Well, that was a good metaphor for finding spiritual and educational Scouts and asking them to take a look at the volume, immerse themselves in it, and bring back a report of what things were stimulating to them, what things looked like they're useful, or what things may have been challenging or problematic. We welcome that as well. So we have 4 Scouts. 2 of them, that would be Rabbi Seth Goldstein and Catherine Carmel, work together. So they'll have a little longer to talk about individual perceptions and what they saw as valuable as an education team. But the place I want to start, what a pleasure to turn to Rabbi Rachel Davidson, a friend and someone I've known from birth, just about, and tell you that Rachel Davidson is proud to have recently graduated from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where she focused on text study and pastoral care. She has worked with college students in retirement communities and in an urban hospital. She is passionate about providing non-judgmental care to people in moments of transition, and will be working as a chaplain resident at the Lewis Stokes Cleveland VA Medical Center. I just want to say that I told our Exploring Scouts that unless you needed some particular help, I didn't want to hear about what you found, because I wanted the joy and excitement of hearing and sharing your discovery. So Rachel, for 10 minutes, take us and share with us, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Jeffrey. I think that was the first time that I've been introduced to a group as a rabbi, so that's nice. When Jeffrey said that I graduated recently, I graduated about 2 weeks ago. So lovely to be here today. So as was stated in my bio, I primarily, in my rabbinical education, worked with college students and people in retirement communities, two seemingly very different communities, but I would actually argue in many ways they are often very similar. And I wanted to focus on my work with elders today, and specifically frail elderly people. I've worked in 2 continuum of care retirement communities and 1 hospital where I saw a lot of frail elders as well. And I was very nervous at first about this work. It wasn't something that I necessarily expected to be doing. And I was especially nervous about working with people with dementia. And I found that, in fact, working with people with dementia was some of the most fruitful spiritual education that I could embark upon. So I wanted to share my learnings from that. And I wanted to really take seriously this concept of Sefer HaChayim, the book of life, lifelong learning, and think about how can we apply some of these teachings that are found in the book in a context where most of us don't think about learning needs or developmental needs. And that would be the moment that many people encounter in their lives where you have dementia or nearing the end of life, that realm. I think this is very fruitful, both because I think it's meaningful for anyone. And I'll also say, as someone fairly young, I think it was especially fruitful to meet people who were many decades older than me and see what I could learn from them. And then in turn come in and think to myself, well, I'm here as a spiritual presence in their life. How can I bring learning into their life or unlock new spiritual growth for them? So we're putting the life back in lifelong, or the long back in lifelong. So the part of the book that I wanted to focus on specifically was the triangle of teacher, learner, and text. Many of the people I worked with couldn't read anymore or couldn't communicate clearly. And so diving into even Parshat HaShavua, let alone a longer or more complicated text, generally was not an option. But if we expand our notion of what a text is, I found it extremely fruitful to think about, as I was reading this book, how if I was the teacher or the accompanier and the other person was the learner or the patient, the client, what were the texts that we were focusing in on together? So I want to tell one story that I think illustrates this. I worked with one woman who I will call Barbara. And I came into Barbara's room. She was mostly pretty quiet. She spent a lot of the day sleeping. She didn't have much of a reaction if you talked to her. And I noticed in her room a picture of her when she was younger, not much younger, maybe a decade, in the grand scheme of her life, not much younger, and 2 friends, and underneath it said best friends. And so I picked up the picture and I brought it over to her bedside. And I said, Barbara, are these your best friends? And her whole face lit up with joy. And she said, yes. And you could tell how much it meant to her to see that photo and to have someone acknowledge it. I think another great example of what text looks like when you're caring for people who are no longer living life the way I live my life, in a very verbal format, is song and music. So I was leading a Shabbat service for about 15 people. And one person I knew had been very prominent in her synagogue. She was a board president. She was an early Jewish feminist. She always wore a kippah at services. But at this point in her life, she was pretty tired and not so actively engaged. But the minute we would start singing, her whole expression would light up and she could sing along to all the prayers, even though she couldn't have very much of a full conversation with you. So what I was really excited about as I was reading this book is thinking about how can we apply this triangle of teacher, learner, and text in new and creative ways. So Rabbi Jeffrey mentions that David Hawkins names this triangle the I, it, and the, what's the third one? And the, oh, sorry, I, thou, and it. So I am the teacher, thou is the person I am studying with, and the text is the it, the thing that we're engaging in together. And if we're just looking person to person, it's just a mirror, which can be nice, but there's something uniquely spiritually fulfilling when we bring in that third element, something outside the two of us that we can both engage in and find new spirituality and new magic. So I think getting creative about that it can be really helpful, because sometimes that it is distanced. When we're communicating on the verbal plane, we have access to a lot of those metaphors that Rabbi Spitzer was talking about. We can really create shared language. We can see how our perspectives on something diverge. When we no longer have access to language in the same way, we have to get a bit more creative. But I think there's unique fruits when we do that. So I actually think that this applies. I think this is learning that I take from work with elders into all of my work, which is that integrating things like photographs, song, sensory materials, music, smells, all of that can really enhance our learning. And it can be a very deep it to engage in. So I want to encourage us, I think, to stretch out a little bit as we look at the three, there were three values that were named in an article written by Rabbi Jeffrey of narrative and peoplehood, values and ethics, and relationship to God. So narrative and peoplehood might look different in different communities. Sometimes we might be talking about who are the most important people in our lives. Sometimes we might be teaching the long arc of Jewish history. And sometimes we might be saying, who are the people here in our temporary community around us? In terms of values and ethics, we might think that children are learning values, but I think in fact, at every stage of our life, there are values to be learned. And in terms of relationship to God, I think our relationship to God changes profoundly in the course of our lifetime. And I want to encourage us to not assume that it has to stay static, or that even if someone can't put into words what their relationship with God is, they might still be able to be forming unique and, to me, uniquely educational relationships with God. So on that note, I want to present my challenge to our community of learners and educators to think about how can we both embrace our own different forms of learning and the different texts in our lives, and how can we meet people in the different points in their lives to hear more about and to listen more deeply to the texts that they value and meet them in relationship around those texts. Oop, Jeffrey, I think you're muted.
I thanked Rabbi Davidson and noted how stimulating that was. And also, well, she just moved to a different place, as often happens on Zoom screens. But on this call is someone who's getting, well, two people who are getting a great deal of nachat from it. Rabbi Steve Seeger, who was Rachel's rabbi for so many years. And right beneath Steve on my screen is Anna Kelman, Rachel's grandmother and a good friend of ours. So we're very glad that she can be here with us. And I want to turn now, thank you again, Rachel. I want to turn now to our next scout, and that would be Alana Krivo-Kaufman. And Alana strives to bring her full Midwestern, white, Ashkenazic, and queer self into building joyous and resilient Jewish communities. As an educator, organizer, and rabbinical student, she has had the honor of working for a world where no one is disposable, that is, in congregations Kehilat Shalom, Jewish Voice for Peace, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, Kolot Chayenu, and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. She currently lives in Brooklyn, works in New Jersey, and goes to school in Philadelphia at RRC. Alana, we're all yours.
Thank you so much. And Rabbi Rachel Davidson and I did not plan to chavruta, but we did talk briefly this morning, and in fact learned that even without meaning to, we both were very focused on and excited by this learner's triangle. So there are in fact 2 chavrutas, and I am able to share my screen. Great. So if you can grab a paper and pencil, if you don't have one, or open up just a spot where you can draw on your computer, I'm going to ask you to join me in exploring the excitement of engaging with this learner's triangle. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Whoops. There we go. Okay, I'll give you a minute to do that. And I want to offer the invitation that I was so drawn to this framing, which I'd seen before in terms of chavruta learning. There's you and your chavruta and the text. And I realized I'd seen it in many other places in my life, this idea of the learner's triangle. That is highlighted in the book, and that there are multiple thinkers that Rabbi Jeffrey lifts up. And so I want to invite you to join me in sort of thinking about what are the infinite triangles that have been in our lives and in our learning process. So the way that it's pulled out in the book that I just found so compelling was that I'm also using my hands, that there's the I and the thou, the teacher and the child, the learner, and the person presenting something to learn. There's this side of the triangle, and then there's the it, the content that compels both. And that phrasing, the content that compels both, just lit something up in me and allowed me, I started at Congregation Kilat Shalom as the education director for my first year. I have a background both in Jewish education and in community organizing. And it was a big, intense year to start as an education director. And this thinking, what is the content that compels both the teacher and the student, just lit something up. And I went through a little bit of my thinking, and then I'm going to ask you to do this as well and see what you find. So the first thing I thought of when I just started drawing all my own triangles was, okay, what does this pull up for me? Well, in community organizing, there's this framework that is in many places, but is put out by Marshall Gans, that we start with the story of self. Who am I? What am I doing here? What do I care about? We connect to the story of us, and then we connect to the story of now. And so thinking about the triangle in that way allowed me to pull up a lot of different relationships, mentors, people I'd learned from, campaigns I'd learned from, texts I'd learned from. And then I thought about my year of learning at RRC and the Israel, God, and Torah triangle that we'd been exploring through different time periods, to different texts in our classes. And I pulled up another layers of relationship, of wrestling. And then I thought about myself, the Shekhinah, and going to Reese and being immersed in the ocean, in bodies, in waves, and in multiple ways that I connect with divinity. And I pulled up a whole other set of sensations. And I thought to myself, I don't know what my teachers, what would they put on these triangles? I don't know that. So how can I be expecting them to teach and engage spirituality if I'm not cultivating an environment and a relationship where that's present? So I got very excited about using this as a tool for talking about teaching, for bringing spiritual connection, talking about God and divinity into the teaching environment. So I'm going to ask you to now, with that pencil and pen that you got or spot on your computer, just take a minute and think about and draw some triangles for yourself. So you can start with the words or you can start with the triangle. And if these questions will help you, I'm going to offer some questions. They're also written. And if you're ready to go, you can start drawing some triangles. Some of the questions are, what triangles have been meaningful for your learning? What triangles illustrate your relationship with spirituality? And what triangles have been fun to engage in your teaching? I'm going to give people 30 more seconds, but if you would like to share any of the triangles that have come up for you in the chat, or if you want to annotate this blank space on the screen with your triangles, if you can see the bar at the top, you might see an annotate, you might need to click more. And that's a way that you could either draw on this blank space in the screen or put in the chat if you want to share some of the triangles. I know there must be a Nachshon triangle out there who wants to dive in and share.
How do we do that?
Well, since you're talking, you could say yours out loud, but if you wanted to either put it in the chat or annotate on the screen, there's an annotate button if you click the top bar. Oh, do you have a triangle you would like to share?
Sure, I'll do it verbally.
Great.
Musar, self, Musar, other.
I love that. Thank you. We have dialogue, new perspectives, and questions. We have me, my grandparents, and we're waiting to see what else happens, and Jewish peoplehood. Steve is asking about a wider range of triangle shapes. Steve, I didn't get to it, but I overlapped 2 triangles and then I made them infinite, and it's like an infinite Jewish star. And I really loved in the book, the idea is raised up that what is happening is not just this complex relationship between the sort of 3 points of the triangle, but that's how a learning community is created when everyone is in relationship. And I think Rabbi Jeffrey talked about this at the speed of learning, that learning at a speed where everyone is engaging with the same text from different perspectives creates a learning community. And so I love that, thinking about shape. We have Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama, me, adult students, Hebrew letter decoding, myself, mindfulness, community served. Thank you so much for sharing all of these. If you have more, you can feel free to pop them in the chat. I am gonna pop to my takeaway slide. Oh, I think, can I clear it? Oh, yes, I can. There we go. Okay, great. So we all are immersed in these many triangles, and I wanted to share that piece was around sort of engaging teachers and creating a learning environment. And then I wanted to just highlight a few of the resources that I thought could be used to do that really well. So things that we've been doing at Congregation Kilat Shalom, using Kol HaNoar for Tefillah and family services, reading in God's name with our 4th and 5th grade families, and having students pick their favorite God metaphor from that book and make a nightlight illustrating it. And there's a Reconstructionist educator who makes those kits, Cashier Crafts. They're really great. And new ideas that popped up for me in reading through these resources and sort of wrestling with these triangles were starting earlier, reading God's Paintbrush with the younger children over a numbers of weeks and rotating the ways they engaged with the metaphors in different ways, maybe bringing flashcards of words and images into tefillah. There's moments where we have the kids offer blessings and having those be tools that they could use to actually say, I'm asking the rock of, my soul, or just the rock. That might make for some play. Also to bless such and such. Bringing in Rabbi Hirsch's matching game, and also that Aaron and the Wrath of God was this beautiful story of how a parent wrestles with their kids' questions, which would be really incredible for family learning. So I think that is my time. And so I just want to invite you all to continue making triangles. I found it really generative, and I'd love to see where your triangles lead you.
Thank you so much, Ilana. Such a fine presentation, stimulating. And I'm going to turn now and leave it to Rabbi Seth Goldstein and Catherine Carmel. I'm going to introduce the two of you. And I don't know the sequence of whether you want, who will go first and when you will be in dialogue, but I note that Rabbi Seth Goldstein has served Temple Beit HaTfilah in Olympia, Washington since his graduation from RRC in 2003. He is currently the immediate past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, a really fine colleague. And Catherine Carmel, who works with Rabbi Goldstein together in the education program at Beit HaTfilah, is the director of family life and learning. She's been that for over a decade. She's also the current chair of the board of directors of the Reconstructionist Educators of North America. And in her free time, she runs a small family farm. This will endear you to my wife, Deborah, with dozens of chickens. So it's all yours. Thank you. I'm going to mute.
Great. We didn't really work out a sequence, but I guess we could just jump right in. And I guess will sort of be just so for those other attending, Rabbi Jeffrey asked us to each share something that personally sort of rose up for us, and then how we might together sort of incorporate something. And I think that from our planning conversation earlier this week, it's become like a Venn diagram, I think. So we overlap. And so so I'll just share first what struck me that I wanted to share, and then turn it over to Catherine, and then we'll sort of join together after she shares what spoke to her. And I think, as Jeff reintroduced, that this is in the theme of Shlach Lecha, the spies going in. I also note that we're coming up on Korach, and so I'll tap a little bit of the Korach energy as well, in sort of turning things around a bit, and sort of breaking down, or sort of taking the sort of progression that we've had in this, that and sort of reversing it a little bit, in the sense that, as Korach said, the whole community is holy. I was just going to say the whole community is learning, as we know. And I'd say, or specifically, the whole community are kids, and the same, that we're all sort of learning in that way. And that is to say, a roundabout way of saying, to introduce them. So what struck me in using our liturgies as learning texts, as teaching texts for a variety of different age groups, but rather than sticking to the dichotomy of Kol HaNoar for our youth and our tweens, and Kol and then graduating, say, to Kol HaNeshama for our adults, to really reverse those and to use Kol HaNeshama as a Kol HaNoar as a teaching text for adults as well. And this sort of comes out of, by accident, as it were, with COVID, in that we, prior to COVID, we had a fairly well moving along family service that we did once a month, with using Kol HaNoar on Erev Shabbat, which we would follow with a community dinner and activities for different age groups that got pushed back with COVID as we moved online. And I think of some of our other offerings was impacted the most because of a variety of things with families. And essentially, long story short, families stopped attending the family service because I think a lot of the things that drew families together, the socialization, the meals and whatnot, we couldn't do. And also the just the overall zoominess of it after days of school, Zoom, and all that stuff. So it was our Erev Shabbat family service that seemed to fall apart. And yet we sort of kept going in that we would still kind of do it each month with the Kol HaNoar. And it was still attended by a few families, but not too many. But what we found is that a lot of the adults really resonated with that text and that liturgy as a way of connecting and deepening their own spirituality. And so